This podcast is brought to you by Deepbridge Capital LLP. Deepbridge is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Please note that investments discussed are both illiquid and high risk and won't be suitable for all investors and should be considered as part of a diversified portfolio. The content of this podcast should not be construed as financial or taxation advice. We recommend investors seek appropriate professional financial advice. Any views expressed may no longer be current and may have already been acted upon. Welcome to Deepbridge Discovery Podcast. My name's Andrew Aldridge. The purpose of this podcast is to bring to life the people and the companies behind what Deepbridge does. So today I'm delighted to be joined by our Head of Life Sciences, Ben Carter, and our Senior Investment Director in Life Sciences, Andy Round. So Ben, Andy, great to have you. Thanks for joining us. Good to see you both. We'll crack on. I've got loads of things to get through with you on this session. So I think first and foremost, I guess a lot of our listeners, our viewers, Ben, will know you already. So if I start with Andy, just to ask you a bit about your background, Andy, before joining Deepbridge, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure, no problem. It's a bit like how long's a piece of string there.
Yeah.
So academically, I've got a PhD in biochemistry that got turned into a small biotech company. This was getting on for about 20 years ago now. We ended up on AIM, raised sort of north of 70 million.
Okay.
Did some crazy licensing deals with some large blue chips. And then had the classic sort of SME journey. So went from 120 people back down to 6. Bought a few businesses along the way.
Yep.
Sold them to pay the fees or pay the salaries. And after that, I was recruited out of that to work in a small boutique consulting firm that had offices in London, Boston, and Tokyo. And it was run by part of the DuPont family.
Okay.
So we did in and out licensing for, again, large blue chips. So my clients were amazing. There were people like Procter & Gamble, DSM, Bayer, Takeda, Sumitomo Chemical. And this is right at the beginning of things like open innovation. So we were teaching large companies on how to basically sell some of their intellectual assets to sometimes large companies, but also working with small companies to understand how to basically license to large companies. And then I joined the dark world of VC and I've been doing mainly healthcare investing now for the past 15, 16 years. So everywhere from IP Group to Maven Capital Partners, more recently at Procura Ventures, where we set up the Procura Ventures business.
Yep.
And raised a reasonable amount in healthcare and some good healthcare deals.
Brilliant. And so you've always been in around the life sciences, the kind of healthcare world, and for your sins, you've always been in that world, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, mainly more than other sectors. I mean, I've done a few sort of tech deals over the years, a few materials deals and various things. There's plenty of overlap.
Yep.
But yeah, for probably the last 10 years, mainly healthcare.
But Ben, obviously recently becoming head of life sciences at Deepbridge, but kind of just remind people very briefly kind of your background, which was predominantly in digital healthcare.
Yeah, no problem at all, Andrew. As you said, I've done one of these before, so it's a good opportunity to shine a light on Andy today. So I'm going to let him do most of the chatting.
Is that you passing the book?
That's me absolutely passing the book.
Delegation.
Of course it is. Of course it is. So I'm slightly unusual from our life science team in that I didn't study a science degree at university. I did business management. Following on from that degree, didn't necessarily know what particular sector I wanted to go into. I joined a large multinational on their graduate recruitment scheme. Spent 5 years there. Ended up in their healthcare department, running that piece there in and around kind of medical device technology. Something that the beauty of a multinational with multiple business units is that I got the opportunity to spend a lot of time, whether that's in R&D, whether it's in legal, commercialization, and I always kind of found that the commercialization aspect of medical devices and digital health was the area that I felt most comfortable. I got headhunted by one of our partner organizations, which I'm sure at the time they weren't particularly pleased with. Spent a number of years there. That was more of a scale up as they had some really interesting technology, and it was around trying to take that product to market. Yep. Managed that successfully, doing kind of the, taking it from kind of £1 million, annual recurring revenue up to £10 million. And then get very, very similar, headhunted out of that one into a startup. I did that kind of 0 to its first £1 million in revenue. So that's where I find it really interesting, and that kind of fits nicely in terms of the Deepbridge portfolio, working with those early stage companies as they look to commercialize their IP. and take it to market.
Those first steps as they that first real important phase of growth.
Well, it is absolutely. It's to my mind the most exciting part of a business.
Yeah. So, Ben, if I just stick with you for a second, we talk about life sciences. It is a very broad term. Kind of what does life sciences mean to you, or kind of how would you break that down?
Incredibly broad term, Andrew, I think. So if you speak to different VCs, different institutional investors, I think broadly they'd have kind of an overlying idea as to what life science is. I think I look at it more specifically towards Deepbridge. We're a specialist life science investor. And if you look at our key specialisms over the past 5 to 6 years, I think that very much centers around medical device technology, around digital health, a small amount in kind of biotech and therapeutics, given we're an early stage fund. And I think also we never invest in anything that we don't understand.
Yep.
So if you look at the makeup of the team, more recently, obviously Andy joining, my background in medical devices and digital health, so a high proportion of the portfolio centers around that. Savas is our chief investment officer who set up the life science portfolio. His background in pharma, working for the likes of JP Morgan as a life science analyst. So I think that's kind of why we got to the level where we are within Deepbridge, and bringing Andy onto the team now I think is vitally important as our portfolio matures, and he's going to bring a lot of new skill sets to the team, and no doubt we'll start to see other areas of life science and subsectors start to enter the portfolio as Andy gets his feet under the desk.
And I think the important thing is, we don't invest in things we don't understand, which is why I'm not in the investment management team. That's that's a crucial thing.
And it's not just the team here. So it's not just myself and Andy or Savas or Bethan and Heather. There are many people that make up our scientific network, our supervisory investment committee. So we have a big reach, and when
a big
you look
pool
at
of expertise.
Yeah, we absolutely do. So whenever we look at a new opportunity, we go out to our scientific community, we go out to our portfolio directors, we go out to our supervisory investment committee members and see what value that they can add to the portfolio before we bring them on.
Brilliant. So Andy, kind of coming on to you then. Obviously, we've touched on your background is largely in this space, and what's so interesting about this space? Kind of what gets you excited, or kind of why should people be excited about this sector, particularly in the UK?
God, long answer. Try to make short.
Go with the long answer, Andy.
Well,
Let me sit back and relax.
Next hour.
I made the question long, so
you did a bit. It's multifaceted answer, isn't it? I mean, there's certain elements of it. UK is a great place to do healthcare and do life science. So we're quite privileged in a way to start that there's more opportunity than you can ever fund. It's an established industry. It spans everything from early to medium to late. There's a good institutional investor network in healthcare. So there's a lot of infrastructure, and there's a lot of infrastructure on top of that in terms of facilities and even just sort of academic networks in healthcare. At the far end of it, part of the joy of being able to invest in these sorts of companies is most of them genuinely make a difference. And there is that sort of slightly sort of philanthropic part to that as well. I mean, you can invest in things that, maybe, will extend the life of people that are going through various different sort of oncology type areas or cancer treatments and things. So you can actually make a difference with some of the investments that we're doing. At the same time, it's a marketplace that tends to perform reasonably well, even through sort of downturns and various things. It tends to hold value, and exits tend to be relatively sensible. And even within that sort of group, there are probably subsectors of that perform better than others, but it's broad enough, and it's established enough. And at the same time, from an innovation point of view, the UK does incredibly well. So we're quite fortunate and quite privileged, as I said before, to be able to look over quite a lot of things in that sort of sector, which other countries are just not as good and not as established.
I'll use that as a quote. Other countries just aren't as good. But I guess you've also got kind of the kind of the range within there as well, as Ben was into, from digital healthcare at one end through to kind of pharma with the other end. I guess that's kind of an exciting opportunity to kind of be involved in as well.
I think Andy was going to center all around kind of patient outcomes there and go down the entire philanthropic route. So I'm glad you kind of touched back onto the prospect of good capital returns. So. Yeah, of course it gets us excited. So if you're looking at patient outcomes, everything that we invest in has the ability to improve, a patient outcome.
Yep.
So, if you've had a really tiring weekend and you're getting up on Monday morning to come back into the office, I think first and foremost, that's one of the things you look at, because there's some incredibly exciting opportunities in the portfolio to make a real difference.
Yep.
But ultimately, coming back to what Andy said, is that if you're making a difference to people, to patient outcomes, if you're making a difference globally, then these companies are going to generate significant revenues.
I mean, you guys are obviously much cleverer than I am, but
no doubt, Andrew. We're not going to argue that one.
But just for me, it's kind of one of the things that I love, particularly in the life sciences sector, is meeting the academics or the founders. They've had that. It's not always a eureka moment, but it's often through years of trying or looking at different things or researching things, they've come to that moment and go, well, actually, if we do X and Y, we'll get Z, which is a better outcome than anything's available currently. And it's fascinating to see that thinking, because it's not something that I'm capable of in that sense. So it's fascinating to see those entrepreneurs and those founders.
There's certainly levels to that, Andrew, I think. So when I look at some of our, the majority of our founders in the portfolio, they're much more intelligent than I am. And I think the beauty and what Deepbridge brings to the table is that we're able to support them through the capital we provide, but also we can put an arm around their shoulder.
Yep.
We've been there, we've done it. We've had our own startups. We've spun companies out of university, etc. So we've seen a lot of the pain points that these founders will ultimately go through on their journey. And working with Deepbridge, then we can help accelerate their growth.
Yeah. So, in the market as a whole, Andy, what trends are you seeing at the moment? Kind of what's big out there? What's exciting you?
Trends don't tend to change too much. I mean, there are the basic ones which never go away. Pharma companies are pretty well broken up now into their key specialty sort of areas. That part hasn't changed. The general trend of I suppose large pharma sort of being good at what they do, which is less R&D and allowing contract research organisations to continue to do that piece, that's continued.
And that's been a change over probably the last 10, 15 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, and whether it comes full circle and everybody becomes integrated again in 10 years' time, I think we'll only really see.
Well, we'll be happy if they're acquiring our businesses, that's fine.
Well, that would be lovely. Yeah. And that really has been, I think, the big change over the last sort of 10, 20 years is the advent of large companies recognising that with their large overheads, they're much better placed to acquire venture-backed businesses in those kind of areas. If you look at the Western world, we've still got those sort of major trends of continuing ageing population. So anything in sort of medical devices or kind of the home care element of getting people out of hospital institutions or clinical institutions and being able to care for them in the home and care for them in the home better, that sort of area continues to grow at pace, and it continues to and will. I mean, even in France, where they're trying to push the pension age, because everybody's living a little bit longer, and certainly aren't paying as much as they were into government coffers. So anything in that kind of area continues to grow at pace. The other area I think that's really interesting at the moment is on the back of things like COVID. So the biomanufacturing type element in the UK is pretty good and second to none. If you then go a layer below that and start to look at some of the research that's been done in there, it's all well and good talking about COVID and sort of viruses and various things. There are a whole raft of unpleasant drug-resistant microbes and various things like sort of drug-resistant pneumonias and various things. So the antimicrobial space is getting a bit more attention than it ever really did, now that everybody's kind of got a reference point of what can happen if you get something like COVID running around. We had drug-resistant pneumonia running around, the death rates would be significantly greater. So that sort of area now is getting a bit more interest, which is good. And then just in general, that kind of digital health piece. So I have done a few investments over the past 10 years in kind of digital health, and some of the sort of very early sort of online GP platforms and things like that. And the reluctance that you found kind of 10 years ago for clinicians to use them, or actually even patients to understand to use them versus now.
I guess COVID was a driver for that, or it accelerated it, with people not being able to physically.
And every man and his dog now has a white labelled GP platform. And that's
we even have one for vets. You say every man and his dog. So
and that just general misconception that you can't diagnose people online when you can cover certain things, certain aspects, but that ability to sort of triage better triage faster and in a lot of time in people's own environments, rather than having people transit from home to clinic or from home to GP service. That's made a massive difference. And I don't really think we've ever seen such, well, certainly in my lifetime, that kind of big sort of social, technical drive that we've experienced over the last 2 to 5 years, which I feel, well, partly even some work-life balance and working environments have changed completely. I don't think anybody's really got their head around the impact of that yet. I think we're only just at the beginning of understanding where that's going.
Yeah.
Andy's given a really kind of full answer there. So I just touched on the last piece around the digitisation of healthcare. Historically, when you looked at the NHS, for instance, which of course is perceived as a relative cash cow for a number of our portfolio companies, they had arm's length organisations within things such as NHSX, NHS Digital, and they're now being consumed by the wider NHS. So it isn't seen as
it's not niche. It's becoming part of the norm.
It's part of the larger infrastructure. And I'll slightly turn your question on its head in terms of trends. One of the questions I was asked on a podcast, not a Deepbridge podcast, a couple of weeks back was, given what's happening globally, are we still seeing the volume of deals? Are we still seeing, opportunities in all of these subsectors that Andy mentioned? I think it's stronger than ever. I think, certainly at the early stage, there are a lot of opportunities out there for disruption. And one of the areas that we're looking at specifically is, do these companies of tomorrow have the ability to disrupt the current status quo? And if they do, then we'll look at them in greater detail.
Yeah, I guess that's the key thing. It's that disruption to create those better outcomes. I guess it's that kind of perfect match. In the market as a whole, so obviously we're seeing great deal flow. There's loads of good things coming out of UK universities, out of accelerators, etc., incubators, various different elements. But kind of at the other end of the scale, obviously there's been a lot of talk over recent months, recording this at early 2023, about market volatility, valuations, particularly in the tech market, etc. Kind of what does the valuation kind of world look like within life sciences? Is a valuations holding up? Is it sector specific? Kind of what are you seeing? Andy, kind of asking you first, I guess. What's your kind of take on the world at the moment?
Healthcare tends to hold value, and without, again, and it's a bit anecdotal, but I think tech as a whole and tech companies as a whole were massively overvalued and have been overvalued over the last 5-10 years. So there is that kind of readjustment that was coming anyway. And it's come and it's been unpleasant for a number of institutional investors. I think Deepbridge has probably weathered it quite well of having quite sensible valuations and a sensible set of tech companies in its portfolio. Everybody feels a little bit of a squeeze at this kind of time, and I have seen some valuations drop on businesses, particularly in things like sort of well-being and wellness. But again, big sector had a load of money put into it over the last 5 years, and investors to some extent, and I'm guilty of it as well, we're a little bit sheep-like sometimes. Something becomes interesting and it's kind of de rigueur and you kind of want something in that field and you end up competing and paying more for it. It doesn't necessarily work out that that's the true value of kind of what it is. Then you end up with a little issue kind of where we are now, particularly on the sort of consumer type stuff where everybody's sort of income is under a little bit of a squeeze. You start to not do some of those things and start to not pay for some of those subscription-based things, which then has a knock-on some of those companies' revenue lines slowing down, which is at that point where they aren't sort of EBITDA positive, they're then going to raise more cash. And raising more cash with a new bunch of investors, if you're in that position, where your revenue line has started to slow, everybody's going to squeeze value. And again, it's a little bit like, in the middle of a downturn where it becomes tougher for investors to raise cash. So it's all kind of circular. You're going to do the best thing you can with the money you get, and you're going to hunt around for things where you can put a bit of squeeze on value while you've got capital. And it's an interesting challenge at the moment, and it's, we've seen it so many times, haven't we? I mean, this is the 5th or 6th sort of downturn in a row. But I remember sort of the 2006, 2007, 2008 kind of blip, regardless of the sort of, a bit sort of later. There were some absolutely fantastic healthcare companies where valuations did take a bit of a beating because there just wasn't enough capital from their institutional investors to kind of prop them up long enough. If you had cash at that point, you got some amazing deals and some awesome companies. And I think for Deepbridge, the opportunity is kind of hunt for those deals while we can. It's a great time to be investing in EIS funds and letting EIS managers find those companies. That's
a fair point.
Andy makes some really sensible points there. I think we're an incredibly active investor. So one of the things that we always do is take a board seat on our companies as they progress. We support the management team with quite often the day-to-day operation. So when you're that close to a business as an active investor, ultimately you're seeing whether they're hitting the milestones that they laid out in their initial plan. So within our portfolio, you are going to see a number of companies that have been subject to delay of clinical trials, or not been able to get into the clinic, or or markets have had other priorities. So there will be a slight drop in valuation there, but ultimately we'd only back those companies again should we see that there is a road to recovery there. So I think that's vitally important.
Somebody made a point to me relatively recently. They said, I guess, particularly on the life sciences side of what we invest in, you're looking to solve real world problems. So if you've got a potential cure for cancer, for example, there's going to be a natural demand for that, and that's not going to be affected. Exactly, that's still going to be there. And similarly, if you are, even you're talking about like well-being and things. If you're looking at well-being, but it's kind of on a B2B world and it's solving a problem that's a commercial problem for organisations, like School Wellbeing Accelerator, etc., people like that, then you're not at the whim, as you said, Andy, of consumers not spending money, etc., and affecting revenues and therefore affecting valuations. You've got a kind of a more straightforward route to market.
No, you're right, and I think one of the things that we've been incredibly good at within the life science portfolio is that we don't always set the price. So if you look at across the portfolio, we've been very, very good at syndicating deals. Yep. So we're not the only investor on the cap table in a large proportion of our companies. And if you've got 2 or 3 institutional investors working behind the scenes to set the price, then actually you're looking at it from different perspectives. And I think when you look holistically across our portfolio, the valuations are still very, very sensible for early stage life science companies.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's an interesting point. That again, a majority of our life sciences companies, we've got at least 1, maybe 2 other VCs on the cap table. Some who are less passive than us, but maybe therefore maybe kind of keen to work with us on the valuations. But I think it's making sure you've got that consistency across what people are thinking.
Well, it is, and to Andy's point, where he's talking about the market as a whole at the moment, where there perhaps would be a pinch on capital for certain companies. If you've got 2 or 3 investors that can roll up their sleeves and support them in a slight downturn, then it can only be
gives you more than a fighting chance.
Indeed.
Absolutely, so kind of looking at the UK then, as Andy alluded to it before, but in terms of what is the kind of ecosystem, what does make the UK such a good place, other than we're just better than other countries? What are you seeing, Andy, in the UK market that kind of is giving that platform for such organisations?
Yeah, we're quite fortunate in a way. I mean, there's lots of specific kind of programs, and for once somebody's on one of these things on a podcast praising the government. But there are a lot of government programs which do support, and I don't want to say prop up because that's the wrong word, but they do support properly early stage businesses, particularly in healthcare and some of the sort of tech sort of things and materials things. So obviously the government's got its own strategy on technology and has particular pillars of interest. Obviously, we're talking about healthcare today. And if you start at the very top and kind of work your way down, there are various things such as obviously SEIS and EIS sort of programs as regards to being able to raise capital and VCT type funds. There's not a lot of other countries in the world that have these sorts of funds, which obviously the government is supportive of, which allows you to basically raise capital as an investor a little bit easier, perhaps, than just sort of standard sort of GP, LP funds, and then allows you to invest in early stage companies. That's fantastic. Then if you look at things like R&D tax credits, I mean, they are just completely alien to a lot of other companies.
Absolutely.
And the reality is, for some very, very early stage companies, that R&D tax credit claim can be the difference between surviving and not. And then if you layer on top of that all the other things such as British Business Bank incentives, even things like enterprise capital funds that allow new managers to get up and running. British Business Bank has done a really good job with the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund at the moment, which I think is coming to the end of its sort of investment phase towards sort of February, March. We're all looking forward to seeing what MPIF2 looks like. The government's basically said MPIF2 might actually be twice the size. So that may get to be roughly about £1 billion to invest in early stage companies across the north of England. And then, the universities themselves have, some really good quality people on both the tech transfer side and the commercial side. and some really good historical institutions that are really good at particular sort of thematic areas. At the same time, they've had some good returns on historical investments, and now it becomes self-fulfilling. They've got sensible size sort of seed, sort of challenge type funds where they can invest alongside sort of private investors as well. The other thing as well is when you look across Europe and more the US as a direct comparator, more than a fifth of the UK workforce is involved in sort of STEM type jobs.
Okay.
So we have a really good technology base and a really good support for people in those sorts of roles. And then if you look at things like capital efficiency in the UK, again, particularly UK versus US, sadly, STEM jobs are not as well paid over here as they are in the US. They're about a third less in terms of salaries. From an investor point of view, that's amazing. Get good quality people,
good value,
just as good as anywhere else, probably better than anywhere else, that are actually really good value. So there is a real capital efficiency point for investing in UK companies.
I mean, to layer 2 points on top of Andy's answer, if you look globally across universities, I think the UK are second in terms of value created in life science spin-out companies. Only the US is ahead there. When you look across those universities, your Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, Imperials, these are universities that we've spun technology and science out of,
and for years.
For years, so you were getting incredibly high quality deals, and then finally on the other sources of funding. If you look across our recent seed stage portfolio, for instance, of the cohort of 8 companies that we added to the portfolio, 6 of those 8 actually had significant Innovate UK grants to stand alongside, and going kind of to some of our more progressed companies. One of those that's raised over £10 million from multiple institutional investors, alongside that has had over £8 million in non-dilutive grant funding to support support that business moving forward. So a high proportion of our companies are subject to a number of these things that Andy's mentioned.
Yeah, and again, I think it's Andy alluded to, it's not often these days that the government gets praised for things, but I guess successive governments who have backed things like EIS, SEIS, Innovate UK, the introduction of the British Business Bank, etc., should be applauded to provide that capital. What kind of one of the things that I'm seeing, certainly, or this may be my misperception, but certainly on regional levels, etc., I'm seeing much more collaboration and kind of clusters and hubs creating on a regional basis. Is that fair? Is that supportive? Is that helping, Andy? Is that fair?
Yeah, it is, and it's probably not a bad thing. I mean, what we need to get away from, and I've banged on about it for years, is that sort of repetition. Mm-hmm. So you end up with a government project in the world of sensors in Liverpool, and then you repeat the same thing in York.
Yep.
All that sort of stuff needs to kind of stop. And I think there's been a much more sort of top-down governmental focus on what sort of regions or what sort of sub-regions are good at certain areas. Yep. So, York and Leeds has always been really, really good in things like regenerative medicine. The Northwest has a big sort of pharma and semi sort of biotech base. So rather than reinventing the wheel and just having this sort of almost sort of competition regionally for the same pot of money to repeat the same thing, I think there is a bit more of a joined up strategy of this area is really good at this. Sheffield has amazing sort of track record in things like materials, be it for automotive or be it for medical devices. Yep. And there's a bit more of that sort of joined up thinking, which is great for us as institutional investors because you kind of know where you want to go. And also, that capital is quite precious. And it needs to be spent appropriately in the right kind of areas. Then if you look at the sort of the catapult centres, they've done quite a good job of, we've got the Cell Catapult and various things, and the Discovery Medicines Catapult, Audley Park, which is not too far from where we are now, I think it has the Discovery Medicines one. I'll probably get shocked because it'd be the other one. I think it is the Discovery Medicines one. But they're great in terms of offering support to early stage companies. So as an early stage business where you probably can't afford to spend on big pieces of capital equipment, you can go and use their facilities and their expertise. You get it at a discount. And for investors, that's fantastic. They get that support. They don't potentially need as much capital in terms of raise. So again, it all goes back to that sort of capital efficiency piece. If we put £1 in, can we leverage £5 from somewhere else to kind of help make those companies successful?
Yep.
It's not always just about the capital.
Yep.
And the UK is good at those sorts of programs.
And I guess it can't all be kind of governmental led. It's all about private sector involvement
Yeah.
and that again, and
Yeah.
academia
Yeah.
as well. I guess I know one of the issues historically that used to be labelled at academia was spin-outs were kind of almost priced too high, or the academia wanted too much for a stake, etc., which was prohibitive to private. And that seems to be easing and seems to be much more collaboration now in those kind of approaches.
I think it's really interesting listening to Andy's answer in that some of the areas that you touched on there, the likes of Sheffield, Manchester, Northwest. I mean, Deepbridge don't have a geographic focus.
Yep.
However, a large proportion of our life science portfolio is based outside of the London region.
Yep.
And to your point around it can't all be government backed. So it's lovely to see the likes of, recently Northern Gritstone, for instance, that set up a new 600 million LP fund
Yep.
where they're backing spin-outs out of Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds University. And it's music to our ears. I mean, certainly given we have 3 spin-outs from Manchester University,
Yeah.
2 from Leeds and
Yep.
1 from Sheffield. So they're already engaging with a number of those portfolio companies. And we hope other investors like that will come
Yep.
to the table as our companies progress and mature.
And earlier, you kind of we mentioned about the NHS, etc. Obviously, it's in the UK is a flagship organisation, etc. And is envied by a lot of the world for various different reasons. It has its own challenges, of course. For kind of life sciences companies, I guess it's what's the benefit and what's the drawbacks of trying to work the NHS? Is it kind of a double-edged sword? Andy, kind of what's your experience or your take on that?
Sure.
Not a bad word to be said about the NHS, given what they've achieved recently.
That's it.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one, and it is what it is. I mean, it's a behemoth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a large organisation. I think the initial misconception I always come across when speaking to people about it is the assumption that it's one entity.
Yep.
It's clearly not.
Yep.
It's 250-ish individual entities, and some are good and some are not as good. We're quite blessed locally in terms of a little bit around things like devolution of healthcare and all that kind of stuff that, between Salford, Stockport and Manchester, you can, and actually Liverpool actually is pretty good. You can get a lot of stuff done. And they've got good outreach programs for early stage companies wanting to deal with them. The brand value should never be underestimated.
Yep.
And also, I think if you look at, say, early stage companies wanting to run clinical trials within hospital environments, again, some are better than others. We're kind of blessed in the network that we have of pretty much knowing some really good ones. They're there to basically help.
Yeah.
And there has been some really good sort of clinical work done through sort of the NHS over the years. And then being able to then take that onto the global stage and saying, look, we've ran this at an incredibly high standard. You've got the NHS badge on it as well. Yeah. Clinically, it's very, very relevant. That adoption piece in other territories is a little bit shortcutted by the fact that you've done it to such a high standard and such a high rigor. And again, I shouldn't be mean about other regions of the world, but I think it does have that kind of brand value. And when everybody looks at it, it's been done to a certain level that does allow you to kind of progress a bit quicker.
We've seen that evidence with some of our portfolio companies that because they've been able to say they work with the NHS have been able to accelerate their kind of overseas development as well.
The other thing you've got to say is that the likes of myself, Andy, Savas have all been responsible for selling technology into the NHS. So we can inject a little bit of realism into some of the portfolio companies. As part of our due diligence process, we're always looking at financial assumptions, we're looking at their routes to market, the size of the addressable market. And so if you've got a new prospect coming to you saying that their technology is going to be fully adopted by the NHS in year 2,
there's some realism that needs to be added to that. Yeah,
exactly. And sometimes we don't just inject that air of realism; we kind of really enforce that home. And that's where, again, when we're looking at opportunities, the NHS can be seen as a cash cow and a huge opportunity, but they need to have multiple routes to market. They need to have multiple
the challenge with the NHS then is finding the right route in, and then understanding the kind of adoption timescales and kind of all that.
And with anything, it always boils down to almost the individuals.
Yep.
It's finding individual people within that who real zealots in their area or real key opinion leaders in their area, and have enough control over things like budgets and resource and all that kind of stuff. And you can only really do that by having a network and by having knocked around healthcare and these individuals for the past 20 years. It is tough to penetrate, and there are some good sort of in and outreach programs. The AHSNs, which are now I think called Innovation Agency and stuff, they do a pretty good job. Again, I couldn't talk for the rest of the country, but they are a little bit kind of hit and miss. It tends to be the individuals who run them who are awesome.
Makes
it's
sense.
Finding the right ones.
Makes sense. And I guess kind of beyond that as well, what are the challenges common specifically to life sciences companies as they're scaling and growing? I guess you have the standard things of kind of commercialization or producing your minimal viable products, etc. But what are kind of key challenges for early stage companies in your space, Ben? I'll start with you.
I mean, given that we back early stage companies, if they can find a problem, I think early stage companies will encounter that, and that comes back to the experience of the management team and the investment team here at Deepbridge. So if we can see an opportunity that's littered with issues and potential issues, then unless we feel that we can override those and seriously lend a hand, then perhaps it's something that we don't make an investment into. So we try and do that. We talked about human capital in the UK. I think it is an issue. Certain geographical areas have a richer talent pool, but you can't get away from the fact that the UK does have a really, really good life science infrastructure, has some world-class professors and scientists that have unlocked great science. And yes, I think that's one area. I think capital, if you spoke to any single early stage founder and said what's the single biggest issue, cash would be right top of their list. And again, that comes back to working with sensible investors like Deepbridge, where we pride ourselves in that continuity of capital. So subject to an early investment and then the company progressing on with their milestones, then Deepbridge would unlock further funding. And then we have a great network of other institutional investors that we've syndicated with on multiple occasions.
We're happy to share that funding. It's not
of course being
selfish about it. It's making sure
it goes back to our previous point that the more, not that you don't want too many institutional investors on your cap table, but if you can get to 2, 3, 4, the likelihood of success goes up by a magnitude.
So Andy, kind of any other key challenges that?
No, I mean I normally look at it as it's kind of a triangle, isn't it? It's people, sort of places and facilities and capital. And they move around in terms of order of what's more important depending on kind of where they are, whether they've raised money or not. I mean, if you've got those three things right, you tend to be okay. But it is tough, and continuity of capital is a big problem for a lot of relatively early stage companies. Is being able to look forward sort of 5, 10, 12 years, and a lot of the times having institutions on their cap table who can go that long and be that patient, and B, continue to back them through multiple rounds. That's always a toughie, and the UK has always been a little bit disjointed on that kind of point. There are clearly institutional investors that do early, middle, and end. I think we're getting a little bit better at seeing some investors that can kind of overlap a little bit more,
smooth that journey.
Yeah, exactly. And unlike in the US, where most US institutionals, if they're doing early stage investments, they've already squirreled away the next 25 billion to be able to do it. We sometimes just don't have that luxury.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So one of the things that we always do on these podcasts, that was really interesting, thank you for that, is, so Andy, you're new to the podcast. Ben, I'm going to let you off this last question, but for every guest that we have on the podcast, Andy, we ask them the all-important question, is about the Deepbridge dinner party. If you can invite 3 guests, dead or alive, but no friends or family, so you don't annoy anybody, who would they be and why? And Ben, you can just heckle and
I will say you will be judged for this. I think when I did my last podcast and mentioned my 3, I think I had about 10 people when they listened to it kind of contact me and say, "Oh, really?"
What were they?
So choose wisely.
Choose wisely. Oh, I'm doomed already. I'm going to try and avoid some of the more obvious ones as well. It's got to be Terry. Bring back the Wogan.
Excellent.
Where does my Radio 2 drive to work? He's just gone. But only if we can have hundreds of Janet and John stories at the same time.
That's fair enough.
Also, I think Terry quite liked to drink as well. So he's kind of high up there.
A pint of Guinness with Terry, and
Yeah, can't beat it, can you?
And surely you're kind of starting to board into the tog world these days, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah,
I'm well and truly in the middle of it.
With you and Terry at a dinner party, I'm not sure anybody else would have room for conversation.
No,
so
no.
you don't need anybody else at that dinner party.
Quite a
Just the two of
battle,
you
isn't
get
it?
the world's
Yeah.
rights.
I know.
Go on, Ed.
So
Who's next?
I'm trying to avoid too much of the Irish theme, but I've got to think for Graham Norton,
Fair enough.
and that's just there's a little bit of like, is he really as rude and amusingly abrasive as he really is, and just that wonderful sort of element of sarcasm.
Yeah.
Just
I'd love
still
to just
makes
ask
me
him stories about filming Father Ted back in the
Yeah,
day. and stuff.
exactly.
That'd
I
be
mean, how
fantastic.
cool is that?
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
And number 3.
Yeah, this is now a tricky one. Now I'm getting a bit geeky now. So probably, and again, it's an age thing. It's got to be Tom Brady.
Okay. Yep.
The man playing professional American football at 45. How the hell? And also, we all want to know what's been going on with the wife. soon to be ex-wife.
There's going to be people who have no idea about that, who'll be Googling Tom Brady's wife now.
they can.
I don't know how you landed on a really good looking, you're very, very talented, billionaire with an ex-supermodel wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Don't know how it happened.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want him at my dinner party because he'd just show you up.
But
No, it's the avocado ice cream. It's like,
of
is
course.
it true or not?
Yeah.
But also, just I guess, as you said, to play that long at a top level of sport, at the highest level of his sport as well, is
in an
dedication that
insane
must take.
game. Yeah.
Excellent. No, interesting 3 and interesting. It'd certainly be an interesting conversation. But and any thoughts on that, Ben? Anything to add?
Not really. I mean, obviously, I tried to heckle him throughout, but he was quite calm under pressure there. I think when he went with it's an age thing, and then referenced the 45, 47-year-old. I mean, come on, Andy.
I've weathered well.
Good. Well, gents, thank you very much for that. I'd love to get you back on later in the year for another podcast to go into life sciences world a little bit more detail, and that was great. But hopefully that gives people an oversight of why we do what we do and why we get excited about the life sciences world that we're investing in. So thank you very much, gents.
No problem at all, Andy. Cheers.
Thanks,
for that.
Andy.
Thank you for joining us. If you have any topics you'd like discussed in future podcasts, please email us at discovery@deepbridgecapital.com. This podcast was brought to you by Deepbridge Capital LLP. Deepbridge is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Please note that investments discussed are both illiquid and high risk and won't be suitable for all investors and should be considered as part of a diversified portfolio. The content of this podcast should not be construed as financial or taxation advice. We recommend investors seek appropriate professional financial advice. Any views expressed may no longer be current and may have already been acted upon.